So what's it like to go on a trip abroad with my husband's money?
My sister-in-law, Betty, arrogantly declared.
I wonder how it feels to live not just off your parents, but also off your brother.
I retorted, feeling a surge of anger at her audacity. Well, you're one to talk. You're a stay-at-home wife, and yet you hire a maid and don't do any housework at all.
That's enough. Both of you, stop it.
My father stepped in between Betty and me as our argument threatened to escalate. With a calm look on his face, he pacified me and looked up at Betty.
Seems like you can't enjoy your trip with us both here. We'll head back home. Sorry for disturbing.
My name is Lisa. I'm nearing my 40s and work while living with my father. My mother passed away due to illness 10 years ago, and my younger brother Jake, who is 5 years younger, has already married and left home. I live modestly with my father in our spacious house. It's not that I can't afford to live alone. I choose to live with my father because I'm worried about him. After losing my mother, he started having frequent health issues and was forced to quit his job as he neared retirement. His condition worsened to the point where he wouldn't eat for days unless reminded, and would be bedridden for almost 2 weeks if he fell ill. I couldn't leave my father alone in such a state. At that time, my brother Jake was already working as a lawyer and had a fiancée. Jake and his wife were planning to build a new home near our house, so it was inevitable that I would stay with my father. Jake is exceptionally gifted compared to me. I never thought that the woman he chose as his wife would turn out to be so unreasonable. Jake's wife, Betty, quit her job immediately after their marriage and became a housewife. She leaves all household chores to a hired butler, and her daily routine seems to revolve around luxury lunches and shopping at high-end stores. Jake is busy with work. Perhaps he doesn't have much time to spend with Betty, but her extravagant lifestyle is shocking. Living close to Jake and Betty's house, I couldn't help but hear about Betty's carefree life. What made it more intolerable were her remarks when she visited our house.
When are you planning to leave this house, Lisa? Aren't you embarrassed to live at home at your age?
Betty would mock me like this quite often. I swallowed the words. I don't want to hear that from a housewife who doesn't do housework and just enjoys herself, and responded with a vague smile. I've gotten to the point where I wish she wouldn't come to our house at all, but my father shows sympathy towards Betty, saying,
Jake might be too busy, and she could be lonely. He doesn't drive her away. Rather, he often invites her to have dinner with us.
I wish Jake and my father would show some understanding of the emotional toll this is taking on me. But when I see my father, who is unbothered by Betty's audacious attitude, smiling while eating with her, I can't help but think that as long as he's happy, that's all that matters. Why on earth did Jake marry such a woman? I often wonder, but I suppose there are qualities in Betty that only Jake can appreciate. I purposely ignore Betty's rude remarks and continue eating in silence. That day, as usual, my father invited Betty to have dinner. Jake has been swamped with work lately, and Betty usually helps herself to food left by the housekeeper. My father, perhaps feeling pity for Betty, decided to buy some expensive ingredients and proposed that the 3 of us have a nice meal together. I wasn't particularly thrilled, but if my father insisted, I didn't have a choice. I bought ingredients from the supermarket in town and managed to whip up some dishes I'd never cooked before. My father, who had been losing his appetite, was delighted and laughed, saying,
I'm particularly hungry today.
Betty arrived significantly past the agreed-upon time, sank into the dining table chair without so much as a decent greeting. The dishes I had prepared were lined up in front of her.
Now that we're all here, let's eat,
my father cheerfully suggested. Betty didn't seem pleased. She poked at the food with her fork, heaved a big sigh, and said,
Do you think I can eat something that looks this unappetizing?
Betty shot me a look of contempt as she glanced at the small dishes. I stared back at Betty, then turned to my father in surprise. My father also looked surprised, his mouth agape as he looked at Betty.
Well, it may not be as good as the meals your housekeeper makes, but Lisa made this from scratch. Can't you be a bit more polite?
When my father-in-law sternly rebutted, Betty immediately pulled a sour face. I never said I wanted to eat with you guys. I'm helping you make some memories, and you serve me something that looks so unappetizing. Can't you consider my feelings a bit? What do you mean by making memories? I muttered, but Betty picked up on it quickly. Betty looked down on me and my father, smirked, and said something unthinkable. Well, your father won't live much longer, right? I'm the diligent daughter-in-law keeping him company, so I expect a generous inheritance. At this, both my father and I were left speechless. The living room fell silent. Could this really be the woman that the intelligent Jake chose to marry? Discussing inheritance before someone's even passed away? There's something wrong with that. Dad, you're going to live for many more decades. Before I knew it, I was shouting. Even Betty, who had been grumpily picking at her gratin, stopped when she saw me letting my anger out. Don't talk about inheritance. To you, Dad may be just another person, but he's family to me. He's also the same to Jake. He's the only living relative left for us who lost our mother. My father gently held me back as I leaned over the table. Panting heavily, I slowly sat back down. My anger towards Betty was still swirling inside my chest. With a deep breath that seemed to pierce my father's mood, I felt my pent-up emotions deflate.
I'll pretend I didn't hear what you just said,
my father said in an emotionless voice. Immediately, Betty's scoff came flying. All I did was state the facts. I don't want the inheritance taken away by a woman who's still living in her parents' house. Betty's words were so refreshingly straightforward, I no longer had the energy to be angry. She bravely rehashed what my father had tried to let slide, and threw her demeaning words and actions at us. I'll leave this rundown house to you, sister-in-law. Looks like you won't be losing your place to live. Betty's shrill laughter echoed. I wanted to retaliate with a complaint, but when I saw my father quietly shaking his head, I swallowed my words. My father was too lenient with Betty. Even though she might be lonely with Jake, often busy with work, it's not right to sympathize with an adult who can't tell what's appropriate to say and what's not. My father looked at my face and muttered softly,
She's the one Jake chose.
My father smiled with a hint of sadness. He looked like a father dealing with a troublesome daughter, and also like a man completely worn out by life. I couldn't say anything when I saw my father's face. I had things to say to both my father and Betty, but I wanted to know what Jake thought about all this more than anything. Does Jake know about Betty's behavior? If he's aware of it and just letting it slide, I have to say something as his sister. In the end, Betty barely touched the food I made and left early after a brief conversation. Only my father and I were left in the large living room.
Creating memories, huh? Maybe she's right.
I quietly exhaled as I noticed my father's figure suddenly seeming smaller when he murmured that. Due to Jake's suggestion, our family decided to go on a trip to France. My father wanted to go to France while he could still walk on his own, so Jake and I planned the trip. Of course, I initially asked Jake to take Dad and go on the trip with just the three of them, without me. Betty would always make snide comments toward me if I was present. I didn't want to ruin the cheerful atmosphere of the trip. However, Jake insisted that it would be best to have someone who usually observes Father's condition, so he ended up purchasing 4 tickets. I reluctantly agreed to accompany them on the trip to France, and as I expected, Betty was in a bad mood the whole time and didn't exchange a single word with anyone on the plane. Once we landed, we went straight to the heart of Paris and enjoyed sightseeing. My father was unbelievably energetic, exploring everywhere. Betty seemed to lighten up a bit when Jake bought her a brand-name bag. She walked arm in arm with Jake, but I couldn't help but notice that Jake didn't look particularly happy. At that moment, I accidentally made eye contact with Betty. She glared at me so fiercely that my heart jumped.
By the way, why is Lisa here with us?
Betty let go of Jake's arm and confronted me.
I asked her to come. In case something happens to Dad, we need someone who can handle it.
Jake tried to step in to help, but it seemed like his words didn't reach Betty. She kept staring at me, snickering. What's it like to go on a trip overseas with my husband's money? Airfare isn't cheap, so don't be extravagant, Betty said arrogantly. We're staying in a suite at the hotel, but it would be fine for Lisa to sleep outside, right? Jake called Betty's name sharply, trying to stop her, but she didn't listen. How does it feel to live not only off your parents, but also off your brother? I felt the blood rush to my head at that comment. Betty, you're the one living off Jake. Even though you're a housewife, you hired a housemaid and don't do any housework.
Enough. Both of you, stop it.
My father intervened just as Betty and I were about to get into a quarrel. With a serene expression, Dad calmed me down, glancing at Betty.
It seems our presence is spoiling your trip. We'll go home. Sorry for disturbing you. Lisa, could you check the bus schedule to the airport?
Without anger or distress, he calmly made his declaration. A smile spread across Betty's face, while a look of panic raced across Jake's.
Wait a minute. What should we do when you guys are gone?
Jake had a sudden realization and tried desperately to keep us from leaving. However, once Dad decided to go home, his resolution was firm. He had me check the bus to the airport, and he quickly set off in the opposite direction towards the bus stop. I had no choice but to follow Dad, while keeping an eye on my brother and his wife.
We'll be just fine without the old man and old lady.
Betty's voice echoed from behind us. I was momentarily angered at Betty treating Dad as an old man, but I had no time to waste on her. I chased after Dad, who was walking ahead, while hearing Jake's cries of anguish and Betty's insults thrown at him. Jake barged into the cafe near the airport where we were having tea, looking desperate. His forehead was covered in an extraordinary amount of sweat, signaling something was amiss. In a frenzy, Jake rushed to our table and bowed his head to us.
I'm sorry about earlier. I'll apologize properly later, but for now, I need help with Betty.
Jake bowed deeply, pleading with Dad. Dad and I looked at each other in surprise. What happened to Betty? When I asked in place of Dad, Jake began to explain with renewed energy what happened after we left. After we boarded the bus to the airport, Jake and Betty took a taxi to the hotel. The problem occurred after they got in the taxi. The English that worked at the tourist spots didn't seem to work with the taxi driver. Neither of them spoke French, and they couldn't understand what the driver was saying. The driver was asking them something, but they responded without really understanding. As a result, Jake said that when he paid the money and got off, the driver drove away with Betty still inside.
I can't get through to Betty on the phone. She might have been mugged or something after she was dropped off,
Jake said, his face turning pale, probably figuring it would be faster to rely on us rather than trying to cope on his own and winding up out of his depth. Jake, who doesn't understand French, asked for our help. My father and I can speak French perfectly. Betty appears to think of my father as an old man who can't do anything, but he used to be a French teacher. And I, too, am a current French teacher. This trip to France was planned by Jake, wanting my father to reminisce about his youth. Once my father arrived in France, he seemed filled with nostalgia and vitality, perhaps remembering his time studying abroad. Since I, too, had studied abroad in France during my student days, after parting ways with my brother and his wife, we slowly talked about our time studying here. My father listened to the stories with a serious expression and eventually gave a slow nod.
Let's return to the city center. I bet the taxi that dropped you guys off is waiting for its next fare there.
With my father's command, we quickly got ready and set off on a journey to find Betty, who had been left somewhere. My father and I split up to look for the taxi that had dropped off my brother and his wife after returning to the city center. Most taxi drivers speak French without resorting to English. Before me, my father found the taxi that had taken them and quickly arrived at the location where Betty was said to have been dropped off. Fortunately, Betty was there, exactly where she had been dropped off, unhurt, slumped over. It was good that she was uninjured, but as soon as she arrived, she seemed to have been pickpocketed, and all her bags and valuables were gone, leaving her sitting there penniless. When Betty saw Jake's face, tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly scowled when she saw us.
What are they doing here?
Betty, who was plainly grumpy, asked Jake, and he sighed heavily.
If it weren't for the two of them, you'd have been left here penniless forever, you know. Show some gratitude.
Betty's eyes rounded in doubt.
What do you mean? Without them, our trip would have been a disaster. You and I, we can't speak French. That's why we ended up like this. But these two are different. Both are French teachers, far better than me.
Betty looked uncomfortable, her gaze flitting over to us. A bad thought sprouted in me, and I dropped the quiet words to Betty. If we hadn't found you, you might have been sleeping rough here. Betty bit her lip in frustration. And also, the expenses for the trip were split equally between Jake and me. How's that? An overseas trip fully enjoyed on the money of an old lady living at her parents'? At this, Betty's shoulders began to shake.
It's your father's money anyway, isn't it?
To Betty's counter-argument, my father gently shook his head.
I didn't do anything. Lisa and Jake, they're doing well on their own. They're my pride and joy.
Just when I thought Betty was glaring at me intently, she fell silent without saying a word. Even though she had been helped, she didn't utter a single word of thanks. I had a mountain of things I wanted to say to her, but my father whispering, "Take it easy," made me hold back and keep my mouth shut. For Betty, this must have been an incredibly humiliating event. She must not have expected to be saved by the one she had been looking down upon. Even Jake seemed fed up with Betty's stubborn antagonism towards us, his face showing clear signs of frustration.
Well, now that the issue has been resolved, shall we resume sightseeing? Let's go to a restaurant I used to frequent when I was studying here.
My father suggested cheerfully. At my father's bright words, the family was once again united. We ignored the depressed Betty and thoroughly enjoyed our trip in France. Upon our return to the States, Jake was constantly apologizing to us, and he surprisingly and abruptly divorced Betty. Shocked, I asked him why they had married in the first place. Apparently, Jake had married Betty because she claimed to be pregnant and insisted he take responsibility. After they married, it turned out that her claim of being pregnant was a lie. However, Jake said he couldn't easily file for divorce due to concerns about his public image. However, his patience with Betty, who looked down on my father and me, had run its course, leading him to decide on the divorce. After the divorce, Betty was kicked out of their new home and couldn't continue her life as a housewife anymore. Of course, there was no maid to take care of the housework for her. What's more, due to a pickpocket incident during our trip to France, Betty ended up losing half her assets. She must be working hard, breaking a sweat by now. My father, remembering his younger days during our trip to France, became noticeably more cheerful and lively. I quit my long-term teaching job at school and am now busy running a French language school at home after some renovations. I'm hoping that my father will also teach French in our school someday. Our dreams as a family continue to expand.